Well, welcome. I'm so happy to be here with you this afternoon to talk to you about my preferred topic, which is really enhancing the lives of children, adolescents, and adults who have autism spectrum brain style differences, and learning how to engage people on the spectrum in an authentic conversation when you're doing an evaluation with that child or adolescent or even adult. I've been spending many years working with students and children and adults with autism spectrum brain style differences, and I've been impressed always with the different stories people have to tell. Each story is unique, and in the evaluation process, I've learned that it's really the essential thing we have to do is to be able to have a conversation with each and every individual so that we can learn who that individual is. So what we're going to be talking about today is really understanding the entry point. How do we get started with people who have different brain styles? How do we get them to engage in a conversation with us? How do we get to know their strengths and their differences? And how do we describe that in an evaluation context? So let's start by talking about my background. I'm a licensed psychologist and a licensed specialist in school psychology who's been working evaluating children and adults and adolescents on the autism spectrum for over 35 years. So I've worked with literally thousands and thousands of people. When I first started out working with children with autism spectrum, I would go into an evaluation setting, starting out in schools, and the child would be there and maybe 10 or 12 people from the school district, and they'd say, figure this out. So I was finding that standardized test measurements weren't giving me the tools that I needed to really understand and get the child engaged with things. I would see that the child had differences, but what I wasn't getting was that nice, unique connection. So I started collecting materials, toys, cause-effect materials, different interesting sensory things that would allow me to have what I call an autism conversation or a sensory-based conversation. So after years and years of collecting materials, working with students in a systematic way, I developed the MIGDAS 2. This is the second edition of the Monteiro Interview Guidelines for diagnosing the autism spectrum. And so what we're going to be talking about this afternoon is how do you engage a child in a sensory-based conversation using the MIGDAS 2 process. This process is a qualitative process. So it's a process where we're really having conversations, we're interacting with children, and we're describing the behaviors that we see, as opposed to doing all that in a way that gives us a score or a number. I'm also the author of a book called Autism Conversations, Evaluating Children on the Autism Spectrum Through Authentic Conversations. This book is for primarily school teams and evaluators, and it includes a chapter on how to discuss the diagnosis with parents. How do you talk with parents when you're talking about their child and their child having a diagnosis or an eligibility of autism? This book is also published by WPS, who published the MIGDAS 2. My second book is called Family Therapy and the Autism Spectrum, Autism Conversations in Narrative Practice. This book is published by Routledge, and it's a book for counselors and therapists to be able to apply techniques that fit with the autism brain style when they're actually doing counseling services with children with autism. I want to start out our time today by talking about understanding the importance of the sensory-based approach. When we're thinking about autism spectrum, most of us think about it as a social communication disorder. We think that there's a difficulty with the individual being able to understand social language, to use social language. When in fact, yes, there are differences there, but the primary difference is really that individuals on the spectrum really organize and regulate around their sensory entry point. So what exactly does that mean? Let's start out by talking about a student that I evaluated recently, and we're going to call him Leon. That's not his name, but we'll call him that. He's a first grader, so he's a pretty young guy, 6 years old, almost 7. Leon is like many children that I've seen throughout the years. He is smart, so he doesn't have academic needs. He has above average to gifted abilities, so he can learn and learns very well, but he has differences that have been confusing for people. Throughout the years in schools, children like Leon who have behavior issues but don't have academic needs, they're oftentimes identified as having emotional or behavioral problems as opposed to having brain style differences. So Leon was no exception. He had what I call reactive behavior routines across settings. When I talk about reactive behaviors, what I'm talking about here is oftentimes as psychologists, we talk about non-compliant behavior. We talk about aggressive behavior. But with the autism brain and the sensory entry point, all the behaviors that are a problem in the classroom that really are challenging at home are a result of the child's brain reacting to input. So I categorize all those things in terms of reactive behaviors. So the child, Leon in this case, reacted to things. He had reactive behavior routines across settings, and some of his reactive behaviors that were part of his routine. I use the word routine here because with the autism brain is constantly looking for routines to manage stress, going through routines, reenacting those routines, creating and maintaining them. So for Leon, when he reacted to demands, to stress, he reacted with the same routines. So his reactive behavior routines included the following. He was almost always inflexible in shifting away from his agenda to follow the agenda of others. So when he was in the classroom, instead of following the flow of what was going on, his brain would become reactive and inflexible because he hadn't finished what he was doing and it was time to move on, for example. So he was inflexible in shifting away from his agenda to follow the agenda of others. Behaviors that we saw that were part of his reactive behaviors for Leon included things like refusal. He'd put his head down on the table, or he'd say, I won't do it, or stop. He ripped up papers, he crawled under the desk, he would just bolt out of the room. He would also, when his incoming demands increased, when he got overly stressed out and really escalated, his behaviors included growling like a dinosaur. So he would lose his words and he would put his hands up like T-Rex and go, "Arr!" do all of his behaviors like a dinosaur. And he would also enter into the physical boundary space of others. So he'd hit, kick, spit, and do those types of things. So I've just described his reactive behaviors. Let's talk about, before I worked with Leon to do his autism evaluation, I wanted to know what his passionate areas of interest are. When you do a parent interview with parents of children on the spectrum, it's so important that you invite them to tell you the story about their child. Tell the story about what does the child do well, what does the child enjoy doing. So when I talked with Leon's parents and had the parent interview with them, I said, what is his passionate area of interest? What does he like to do? And the mom said, Super Mario Odyssey. He loves Super Mario Odyssey. Well, many children love it, but he passionately loved it. He knows everything about it, doesn't want to stop playing it, is very inflexible when he has to do anything other than that. The other things that he liked were exploring game glitches on the computer. When a game would have a glitch, he would look up how do you fix the glitch. And he also liked building with Legos. So I want you to think for a minute about these three things. These three things all have something in common. And what they have in common is that they are a match for visual thinking. When you're playing video games, you're playing visual, you're using your visual brain, you're using your strategic thinking brain, and you're using your visual manipulatives if you play with Legos or build with them. So these activities all have this visual, tactile, strategic thinking quality. They also have something else. They have low load social language demands. While he's playing those games, he doesn't have to deal with the input of having a conversation with someone. He doesn't have to deal with the input of the unpredictable nature of the social world. So low load social language demands. So when I was preparing for my interview with Leon, I learned, and this is something you'll need to do as school psychologists, you really have to learn a little bit about their area of interest. That doesn't mean you have to play Super Mario Odyssey, but it does mean you need to know something about it. So I did my research. I, of course, know about Mario games. And here's a little known fact that's really truth is stranger than fiction that a young guy with autism told me about recently. He said, did you know that the president of Nintendo is named Mr. Bowser? and Bowser is Mario's big nemesis. So in real life, the guy who runs Nintendo right now is named Mr. Bowser. So he told me that, and he put his finger up to his chin, and he said, and that's a little known fact. I said, well, I'm going to pass that on to other people. All right, so preparing for the sensory-based interview, I wanted to have a few facts about Super Mario, and Super Mario Odyssey in particular, because that was the game he was into at the time. So this is what I learned. Okay, I went online and I found out Cappy, his hat, takes on qualities of characteristics of characters and objects. You can become, Cappy becomes a dinosaur, Cappy becomes Bowser. And the other thing I learned was that each level goes to a different travel location. Egypt, for example, they had like a pyramid. So it doesn't matter if you know anything more than that. It's just the point of this is that when you're talking with the child, you want to set up a conversation that indicates that you're really seeing the world from his or her perspective. So if I say, well, I'm an adult and I don't play Super Mario, but tell me about it, that's really not going to be inviting the child to really share his or her passionate area of interest. But if I start out by asking, making declarative statements, or asking comparison questions about Super Mario Odyssey, then the neurotypical brain, child brain, looks at me and says, why are you asking me this? What's going on, right? Because that's the social context brain. The autism brain says, like an oasis with water in the desert, says, oh my goodness, you are speaking my language. Nobody ever wants to hear me talk about this stuff. So they then correct you. So don't worry if you don't know real facts about it. Just know a few things because they will correct you and be very grateful that you're talking about it. Well, of course, I also knew that Mario says, here we go. That's his big phrase that he says. I worked with a kindergartner a few years ago he was a very petite, sort of sturdily built guy. He had dark curly hair, and he would walk down the hallway and he'd say, here we go, and he'd spin around every time. So he was actually living the Mario dream as he walked down the hallway. When I interviewed that kindergartner, I said to him, what do you like to play on the playground? He says, well, Super Mario. And so I said, well, who do you play with? And he said, well, I play with my friend Paul, and I'm Mario and he's Luigi. So I said, well, what happens if he wants to be Mario? Are you Luigi? And he said, sadly, that could never happen. And I said, what do you mean that couldn't happen? And he said, well, you see, he patiently explained to me, Mario is older than Luigi and I am older than Paul, so it could never happen. So then I said, what happens if Paul decides he wants to play something else? Well, this beautiful young kid says, well, that's fine, that's really good. He can go play what he wants to, and I'll keep playing Mario by myself. So that is the autism object-focused, sensory-focused brain. So with Leon, I was prepared to have a conversation with him. But I needed something else besides knowledge about Mario Super Odyssey. I also needed some interesting manipulative materials to start the conversation. Because even though Leon was highly verbally fluent, meaning that he had lots of language, he had no delays, he was actually gifted in his standardized language testing, for him to have a conversation with someone, if he's initiating it, he's able to talk with lots of detail. But the autism brain, remember I talked about reactive behavior routines. The autism brain reacts with stress to incoming demands. So my starting a conversation with him, even about his preferred topic, unless he's already in a routine with me, is going to create that stress response where he's going to shut down. So I wanted to have manipulative materials so that I could have a way to have an object-focused conversation with him that didn't require verbal language. So there's 4 features to having a conversation with someone, and there's 4 features, the same 4 features, that have to do with playing with someone. And the autism brain does one of them fairly well, but the other 3 not so well. So let's look at Leon. His ability to initiate conversations about Super Mario was pretty good, but only initiating on his topics. He didn't really talk that much when he wasn't talking about that. So the 4 features of communication and play that we're looking at when we are doing a conversation with a child in a clinical interview are, does a child have the skills to initiate or start a conversation? The second skill we're looking at is, does the child have the ability to engage in what we call a shared exchange, a back and forth, where they say something, we say something, and it goes back and forth. The autism brain has a lot of difficulty doing this. The third thing we're looking at is whether or not the child can be flexible and shift from the topic that they're interested in to talk about something else. So in the evaluation that we're going to be unfolding today, the method of evaluating, we start out with interesting manipulatives and topics of interest, and then we move into stressing the child a little bit by making demands to engage in a flexible shared exchange with us about social topics. So initiating, sometimes they can do it. Sharing exchanges is difficult. Being flexible is difficult. And the fourth feature is extending the conversation, keeping the conversation going when the conversation is not about the area of interest that they're knowledgeable about. So with Leon, I had some interesting manipulative materials to start the conversation. Now, when I met Leon, I wanted to start the conversation without social talking. So what we do, and little talking at all, not really talking to him very much. What we do when we meet people is what? We talk to them, right? We engage with facial expressions, eye contact, physical proximity, gestures. All those things are part of the socially wired brain's way of saying, let's get into an exchange. The autism brain doesn't read those cues very well and is constantly responding to them in a reactive way. It's like, wait, danger, danger, too much going on. So when I met Leon, I wanted to make sure that I sent a signal to him in the evaluation that this was going to be different from what usually happens, right? Because what usually happens is adults talk to him, right? And they ask him social things, and then he kind of backs off and says, starts acting like a dinosaur, right? So rather than talk to him, I wanted to start out and give him an opportunity to be the one to do the initiating. So this is a part of the autism evaluation process qualitatively that really makes a difference in your being able to engage children in the process. So when he came into the room, he came in with his mother and he stood behind her. And as soon as he saw me, I wanted to set up a reduced stress situation. As soon as Leon saw me, he scowled and went behind his mother, and you can probably predict what he did. He started acting like a dinosaur. So he did his dinosaur thing. So what was he signaling to me? You're unpredictable, this is stressful, I am not buying this, I'm not going to come in and interact with you. But I focused on objects of interest to provide the sensory entry point. So instead of talking to Leon, what I did was, because I could have started talking about Super Mario Odyssey right then, and what would have happened if I started talking about that? He was already dysregulated and he would have continued to shut down. He needed to learn from his interactions with me that I was getting it and I was on his wavelength. I was following his worldview instead of he had to follow my agenda. So I didn't say anything, but what I did do was pick up a spinning light up toy. And I turned it on. This has been in my suitcase, so let's say a while ago. So set something up, usually it lights up a little more. I did this, and you can be Leon. So as I turned it on, Leon's looking at this, right? I'm looking at this. I'm not talking to Leon. So what are we doing? We're having a sensory-based, object-focused exchange. So then without talking, I hand it to him, and he takes it. So now what I've done, so you're going to look at it and enjoy that for a minute. So you're looking at that, you're feeling the vibration, all of that. So as Leon is doing that, am I talking to Leon? No. Is Leon talking to me? No, Leon's not talking. Leon is object-focused. But he's also taking in that I am responsible for this, right? So he's associating me with what? Increased stress or decreased stress? Reduced stress, right? So you have to be patient. You just sit there like that. So he's doing that, and then I have another similar item. Because if you just have that one, and the lights went out, so I want to maybe fix it, what happens if I do this? Leon's going to go like, oh, well, you're just like everybody else. You know, you're just hijacking my play. So you've got yours, and then I turn mine on and turn it off for a minute, and then I hand it to you. and you grab that. So you've now got control of all the toys. So you do what I call hijacking the play, which is it's all about the objects, but now you start to look at me because it's like, who are you, lady? You've got some stuff. This is not bad, right? So I still don't say anything, because if she looks at me, if Leon looks at me and I start doing the social thing, what is Leon going to do? Whew, the plexiglass barrier is going to come up. So instead, he's playing with that stuff. I'm letting him do that, but I'm sharing it. So you have to be intensely focused on, I'm with you, but I'm not putting demands on you. So as I do this, then what happens is, and now if you want, I'll be Leon. So I'll be Leon. So now Leon is comfortable. Leon is going to initiate. So what Leon says is, your batteries are running low on this one. This one has a star in the middle. It kind of looks like a universe, right? So what is he doing? He's initiating a conversation that's describing what he has a visual context for, right? He has a context for this. He doesn't have a context for, hi, how are you? Let's have a conversation. He has a context for this. So once he's initiated the conversation, he has given me the autism social overture, right? It's like, hello, I'm here at your disposal. Let's have a conversation. So then I was able to, that was established. Then I could open the conversation about Super Mario Odyssey. So then what I asked Leon was, I said, so Leon, in Super Mario Odyssey, have you ever had Cappy turn into Bowser and go to the pyramids? I have no idea if it actually does that or not. It doesn't matter, because I use the key words, right? The keys to the kingdom. I started talking about the little features of the game. So this is what happens to children when you wait, don't engage in social conversation, have an object-focused entry point, wait until they initiate. What happens is the student their brains become alert and engaged. So all of a sudden, Leon, who had 5 or 10 minutes earlier been giving me the dinosaur brush off, right, was now going to be the expert. So you can see the alertness and engagement is the child kind of goes, oh, they get organized about it. And so he said, well, actually, they oftentimes use that phrase. He said, well, actually, I have been at the pyramids, but when you're at the pyramids, Cappy is actually blah, blah, blah. So then he starts explaining to me. So then the hard work for you begins, because you have to follow what they're saying, which you don't have a context for, right? Unless you play Super Mario Odyssey, you don't have a context for, but you have to act as if you're following that conversation. It's not that hard to do, but it does take good short-term memory, because what you have to do is listen to the last 2 or 3 things they said, and then you repeat them. And so when Bowser and Cappy go to the pyramids and this happens at level 4, what happens next, right? So you do something like that. And then they'll interrupt you, and they'll do all the things that show that they're most comfortable with a one-sided conversation, right? They're most comfortable if they start it and they keep it going, and then if your participation is to be corrected, pretty much. So we had this nice, long, beautiful conversation all about Super Mario Odyssey. At the end of the interview time together, we explored many more sensory materials, because I wanted to get not only information about what alerts and engages his brain, but also what things does he use to organize and regulate his behavior. So having lots of sensory materials that can be organized and used is really important. At the end of our time together, Leon came over to me and patted me on my knee and said, if you ever need help with your Super Mario Odyssey game, you are welcome to call me anytime. So he's my IT guy on speed dial anytime. So what is beautiful about that is he was giving me the gift. And what was the gift? The gift is, thank you for giving me an opportunity to be myself and to be appreciated. That's what he was telling me by patting me on my knee and telling me that I could call him on speed dial. The other thing that was happening was he was telling me that his brain wasn't recognizing hierarchy, social context, right? It's like, he's never met me before. Why would he give me his phone number? All those things. But he was this genuine person. So writing that in his report, being able to tell that story, then 20 years from now, if you write your report where you talk about a child that way, you will remember that child because that's the memorable moment with them. You cannot get these memorable moments by giving a standardized test, because a standardized test, by definition, is teaching the child. You give them a prompt, they respond, and you record the response for that. And so it's a very much an examiner-driven, and there are valuable things that we gain from examiner-driven evaluations, but what we really need is to really understand and individualize the diagnosis. We need to have these moments where the child becomes alert and engaged and his own person. So starting with the sensory entry points of object of interest, paired with limited talking, and the introduction of the preferred topic sets up a positive experience for the student, right? He had a very positive experience. Over the course of my many years of doing this, I work in a lot of schools as a consultant. I'll go in and 3 months after I've seen a student, I'll be standing in the hallway getting ready to observe some other student, and then whoop, I'll feel somebody who's in my personal space, because they always have trouble with personal space. He'll be right in my personal space and he'll be saying, you remember that, light up to it? You know, they'll be talking with me about something that they remember from that time. I had one student, he was a high school student, he came up to me, we'd had this long conversation about Star Trek, TOS, the original series. Apparently, you know, there's all sorts of different Star Trek things. He was a TOS fan. So we had talked in detail. In the middle of our conversation, he was a 10th grader who had had a diagnosis or an eligibility for special education as anxiety and depression. But his parents had said, is there maybe something else going on, possibly on the autism spectrum? So he's sitting there telling me all about, you know, the episodes in Star Trek TOS. And so the bell rings, and we all said, it's time to go, right? And he said, yeah, I heard the bell. And then he said, but another thing that happened in this episode, because he was having such a positive experience. So then we said that was the bell for lunch. And he said, I have an idea. Let's just have lunch in here today. Having such a positive experience. Two to 3 months later, he comes up and I hear this whoop, this kid right up here, and he was like, you know, we didn't really discuss the trouble with tribbles last time, but we really need to talk about that episode. So they have this positive experience with you, which is really important. That's important for them because if we know what alerts their brains and engages their brains and feels good to them, then that's an entry point for how we can teach them to monitor and reset their brains when they're getting stressed. So we need that information to do good programming for students. So we also get an individual and nuanced profile. In my describing Leon to you, you have a sense of who he is as a little person, right? And that is what we're going for in evaluations. And we're also looking at something that's very crucial and key, and that is we want to get a profile, a behavior profile, of the student's strengths and differences. In education terms and in clinical terms, we always talk about deficits, right? We talk about autism as a deficit of social communication and restricted interests and repetitive behaviors. It's all terribly negative. And so we don't really get a lot of training in talking with individuals about things in positive terms, in setting up a positive narrative. But really what we're talking about with autism is a pattern of strengths and differences, because they have strengths. Leon had many strengths, but he also has differences. If we talk about his differences as deficits, we're missing the point, because one of his key differences, remember when I talked about what he likes to do, which is playing video games and strategic games and building with Legos, that's visual thinking with low-load social thinking. That's a difference. That can also be a strength, right? Many people who understand their brain style differences and understand that where they get energy is from visual three-dimensional thinking with low-load social, then can create work environments and life environments that are very much fulfilling and good for them, as opposed to going through life internalizing, there's something wrong with me because I don't think the way other people think. All right, so we wanted to identify his autism spectrum differences in individualized terms. So parents aren't coming to you, and teachers and individuals are not coming to you to find out the label of autism, yes or no. What they're really coming to you, especially in the area of autism spectrum, they're coming to you after they've heard many parents who have children like Leon have heard, my child has ODD, ADD, ADHD, all sorts of acronyms, oppositional defiant disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder. They hear all these disorders, right? But there's this laundry list of disorders, but no autism spectrum. So what the child and the parents begin, and teachers begin to do, is they begin to assume that the student is willfully misbehaving, which is not the case. And so if someone's willfully misbehaving, then there need to be consequences for that. Well, with the autism brain, which is a reactive brain, consequences don't really help because the child isn't able to control that reactivity or understand it. The child internalizes, there's something wrong with me. I see many children who hit themselves in the head and say, I want to die. I'm different. Something's wrong with my brain. And really, there's nothing wrong with your brain. 1 in 59 people have this brain style difference. It's a difference. So we want to use that terminology of strengths and differences. All right, so we want to, of course, gather our memorable moments. I shared one with you about Leon. Here's another memorable moment that occurred with Leon. I asked him, I said, do you know why we're having this conversation today? Why you're here today? So he thought about it for a minute, and he did what many children on the spectrum do while he was talking to me, and he had some of these magnets. You can put him into a ball formation, all sorts of different things. So he's sitting with his legs in sort of a W position with his back to me while I'm asking him that question. So he answers me, but he's not looking at me. So what's going on when a student does that? They're not being rude to you. What they're doing is blocking out the stress of having to sit and have a conversation with you, so they're able to engage because they're regulating. So he was regulating with his back to me, and so I said, Leon, do you know why you're here today? So he thought about it for a minute, and then he said, well, you might say I've been experiencing technical difficulties. And that was his memorable moment. And so what he was really saying was, things aren't working out so well at school, right in the classroom. You might say I've been experiencing technical difficulties. So these are the memorable moments that come when you're not making the student follow your directions, but you are giving the student an environment that says, we're really wanting to answer the question, what are your strengths? What are your differences? What alerts and engages your brain? And can we experience and share that with you and then put some words on it to describe it? So that really is the foundation of the MIGDAS 2 approach. So let's talk a little bit now about how to learn to use this sensory-based diagnostic interview so that you can better recognize and describe, because many of you are going to be able to recognize it when you see it, right? You'll recognize the behaviors that are different, but you may not be able to describe them. So if we can't communicate to other people what we're seeing, if we just say it's a little quirky, that's not really descriptive. Or if we say, well, he's kind of ADHD, or she's kind of AU, that doesn't tell us anything. We need to be able to have the language to describe. So part of what we're talking about in here today with this sensory-based diagnostic approach is providing you with the tools to be able to elicit the behavior or invite the child to show you the behavior, and then have the tool that gives you the language to describe what you're seeing, and then you do all of that before you decide what you're going to call it. If you go into your evaluations thinking, the parent referred and the school doesn't see it, and so I don't think it's autism, this parent just wants their child to have autism. I hear this all the time in schools. Guess what happens if you go in there with that hypothesis? You amplify the things that fit that, and you explain away everything else. So what we want to do with our autism evaluations is describe, 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 and then back into what we're going to call it. Because once we tell the whole story, it's either the story of autism, spectrum differences, or it's not. It's the story of something else. So we want to make sure that you leave your hunches at the door when you work with children, because you really aren't going to be helping yourself by deciding in advance it is or isn't. Even with students who greet you by flapping their arms, hopping up and down, coming over and sniffing you, right? In other words, they do everything that's all this sensory-based behavior that you associate with significant autism, you still don't know that child. So you don't want to go in and say, well, this child has autism. We want to go in and say, okay, that's how he's greeting me. Let's see what happens when, I don't react negatively to that, and then I give him something that is going to really give him something to do with his hands, right? So then we are really going to begin to describe that individual child. So we're going to learn how to use that sensory-based diagnostic interview to better recognize and describe the distinctive and individual autism spectrum profile for students across ages and ability levels. We're also going to use a descriptive framework to understand and organize our observations that we gather during the interview. For many clinicians, when they do autism testing, they will be taking tons of notes about what they see, right? And sometimes they're writing things on all the margins. Many evaluators who use the ADOS modules will write tons of descriptive information in the margins, but then when they finish the evaluation, they're focused on going through the scoring protocol, the algorithm, and then looking at how it all fits together. And what happens to all that descriptive note-taking? There isn't an organized place to put it. So if you are using the ADOS, you're going to want to use a descriptive framework as well. So we're going to talk today about how to use a descriptive framework to organize your observations. We also want to have, of course, that descriptive language so that we can highlight the pattern of strengths and differences. So the MIGDAS 2 process really is designed to give you the framework and the language to be able to sit down when you're working with a student, the guidance to go through an interview with parents where you're getting the parents to tell the story about the child, an interview with teachers where you're getting the teacher to tell you the story about the child. And in both those cases, parent interview and teacher interview, behavior rating scales only tell part of the story, right? When a parent fills out a behavior rating scale or a teacher fills out a behavior rating scale, they have an idea in their mind of what they think of that student, and their ratings are going to reflect that. Oftentimes with evaluations, the ratings don't match up between one setting versus the other. And this confuses a lot of clinicians about, well, if it doesn't add up, then it can't be autism, right? But really, sometimes the demands of the environment in one environment exceed the student's capabilities. Let's say that when they're in school, they're getting too stressed out because they're not getting enough of their sensory downtime. So they have a lot of reactive behaviors at school, but at home, the demands of the environment do not exceed their capabilities, so they don't show as many behaviors. So the rating scales are going to reflect, in one setting, lots of autism behaviors, in one setting, none. So we want to have the parent interview and the teacher interview to give a platform for parents and teachers to tell the individual story. So the MIGDAS 2 parent and teacher interview asks questions like this. Rather than asking a lot of detailed questions about early development, although there are some questions about that, it starts out with, tell me what's on your mind right now. What are you most concerned about right now with your child? So they have a voice to tell you that and put it in a written format. You then, when you write your report, can just type out what the parent said, and they read it, and what do they feel when they read that? They feel like they've been heard and that you took the time to individualize this. I had a parent bring me a report not too long ago, and they said they never interviewed me, but they said parent reported that sometimes the child does this. Parent reported that oftentimes. So what were they doing? They were taking the rating scale information and saying it was a parent narrative. So when I explained that to the parent, she said, oh yeah, I did fill out those rating scales, but they still never talked to me. So we also ask in the MIGDAS 2 parent interview, it asks questions like, if you had to pick 3 qualities that best describe your child, what qualities would you come up with, right? What do you hope to gain from this evaluation? What have you read about autism spectrum disorder so far? What kinds of changes would you like to see put into place in your child's school? So it asks parents to really tell you the relevant things that they're talking about, in addition to learning about sensory preferences and sensitivities. The same thing is true with the teacher interview. So the MIGDAS 2 starts out with parent and teacher interviews. Then the other part of it is really looking at the diagnostic interview when you're interfacing with the child, the adolescent, or the adult. Okay, so we want to really look at comparing and contrasting behavior patterns that are either consistent with autism spectrum disorder. So we, in the protocols when we're working with the student, like with Leon, we were looking at the MIGDAS 2 protocol, gave us the language to be able to identify, the things he was doing, when we describe them, when we read these descriptions, those fit Leon and they're consistent with ASD. Or when we read these things, they were consistent with Leon, but they're in the category of not consistent with ASD. Or he did some things that were and some things that weren't, so it was a little unclear. So the MIGDAS 2 gives you a profile of descriptive language to begin to, in a very detailed way, and a very accessible way, describe. Is this what we're seeing more consistent, not consistent, or is it a little unclear? We're going to really, what comes out of that? Once we've decided that a student has a profile that's consistent with ASD, then we're going to be able to develop a profile of strengths and differences. So we'll be able to say, this is what the student does well. These are some things that are different. And so we can use this, leverage the strengths to support the differences. So each MIGDAS case, when you use this method of evaluating, you can come up with an individualized behavioral profile that highlights strengths and differences and describes the child. So you want to use a range of autism assessment tools in addition to the MIGDAS 2. And let's talk about a couple of the tools that you're going to use. One is, I oftentimes, when I do the MIGDAS 2 interview protocols, I also use the CARS 2. There's two versions, the standard and the high functioning. The standard is for children 2.5 years to 8 who have limited to no verbal fluency and have some intellectual challenges. In other words, more level 3 or classic autism type presentation of brain style. I also, for higher functioning students from ages 6 up, you can use the CARS High Functioning, which has great descriptive language, and both of those measures are standardized, and they're the only measures that are filled out by you, the trained rater, and they're also the only measure that takes all sources of information into account. So it's really important that you have that standardized CARS measure in addition to using the qualitative MIGDAS manual method. So let's talk about narrative. The evaluation work that you do with students, with their parents, with their teachers, is a powerful way and part of how they formulate their story. So if you go in and you say, this child has characteristics of autism spectrum, but we really think he's got an emotional behavioral problem. We really think anxiety describes it better. This happens all the time. What we're doing is we're using our power to shape the story that's extremely confusing for parents and for students. And it also is misleading because what it's not really taking into account is that there is some neurodiversity there. So there's some neurodevelopmental, neurobiological differences that are affecting the way the child engages with input. And so we need that piece. So we want to make sure that you understand when you're doing these autism evaluation that the work you're doing is a powerful part of how they shape their story. I see students all the time who are middle school, high school, or emerging young adults who have not gotten evaluated for, they've been evaluated for autism, and they've been told time and again, you have some characteristics, but you don't have autism. So this is extremely confusing because then the student says, well, if I don't have autism and I'm just anxious and depressed about things, then it's hopeless. I should just kill myself. So you get a lot of then more depression, more anxiety. And what happens to the self-esteem for these individuals is it's debilitating. They end up thinking, there's something wrong with me, I just can't function. I see this time and again. When they get their diagnosis of autism spectrum, this is a difference. You've got strengths and differences. And you know what? There's a whole tribe of people out there who have your types of strengths and differences. So they go from the isolated other position of I'm marginalized and really they're defective. They go from that to this relief of now I understand it. One young man told me, he said, well, this explains why I'm so different from my ADHD pals. And he said, and come to think of it, it's why I'm at the bottom of the social hierarchy. So, but he wasn't like upset that he was at the bottom anymore. What he was saying was, wow, I understand it. And so now I don't have to be part of that social hierarchy. I can find my own path, right? So this is really important. How you do the narrative in your reports changes lives in ways that make a huge difference. All right, so it's a powerful part of how teachers view. Teachers say this all the time. They say, he only does it when he wants to. You know, when she chooses to participate, she can participate, right? So they always this about choice, right? And, or he knows what he's doing. He's intentional about it. He's manipulative. She's, you know, a dreamer. There are all sorts of names for things. What they're talking about there is that there's choice involved. And really, they're missing the point that when the child goes from the binary autism brain of everything's okay, I'm not overloaded, to all of a sudden the binary part of, whoa, too much going on, I'm becoming a dinosaur brain, right? That they're not in control of that and don't have a visual context to understand it. So you're very much a powerful part of how that happens. And the sensory entry point really opens the door to capture that narrative, just as we captured it with Leon. So I want to talk now about, I've mentioned that we're emphasizing areas of strengths and differences. Let's talk about some other things that we're doing. We're going to translate and reframe negative labeling. So instead of saying that a student is doing negative things, we want to start talking about it positively. So instead of saying that someone is obsessive or OCD or hyper, right? These are all labels. What we want to do instead is have a positive reframe. So the reframe or translation becomes this. We want to talk about what does the student do to organize and regulate his or her behavior. They organize and regulate by creating and maintaining predictable routines, right? So the predictable routines are the ones that we want to start to look at. So we don't want to call them restricted interests and repetitive behaviors. Of course, for Leon, it's a restricted interest about Super Mario Odyssey. But if we talk about it instead about what organizes his brain, what regulates his brain, well, he creates and he maintains predictable routines. So I added including movement routines because the labels we just used were OCD, AD, and movement and ADHD. So when we do this descriptive reframe, when we move from saying it's a label of some sort of disorder to talking about the students organizing and regulating, we change the focus from negative to looking at two things. We start to describe the form of the behavior, what does it look like, what's involved in engaging in the behavior, and the function of the behavior. So let's talk about form first and then function. So describing the form and the function of routines, if we describe that, here's the form of the routine, here's the function of the routine, then we have creative ways to start really coming up with strategies to support their differences. So building with Legos becomes visual three-dimensional thinking, right? That's what it is. It's strategic thinking, and it's low-load language and low-load social thinking. So we begin to describe it like that, so then we can talk about the function. Well, there's three main functions for routines that help organize and regulate behavior. And the first thing it does is it organizes behavior, right? When the child does a routine, they're organizing. The second thing they do when they're doing familiar self-initiated routines is they're regulating. Their system is calming down and staying predictable and organized, and they're not feeling overly stressed. And the third thing that it does is it blocks out incoming sources of stress. Remember I talked about Leon being with his back towards me while he was answering the question about he's having technical difficulties. These are things that we need to pay attention to in the evaluation, because what he's doing with the materials is organizing, because he's doing creating and maintaining a routine. He's regulating and he's blocking out incoming sources of stress instead of shutting down, running out of the room, or doing those other behaviors that he typically does. So if we translate that from the evaluation setting to the classroom setting, what does that tell us? We can create areas in the classroom where the child can have a menu of brain reset activities where they can go and begin to have a sense of powerful, capable ability to regulate, as opposed to being at the mercy of when am I going to feel overwhelmed. So we want to shift that narrative from the story of autism spectrum disorder to the story of the individual. All right, so comprehensive framework is really important because of this. 83% of the time, children who have autism spectrum brain differences have something else going on as well. So we think of it, oftentimes we will identify the 2 or 3 other things that are going on, and then we'll say, but it's just a few characteristics of autism. We don't want to take that step to say it's also autism. So we want to be able to really understand that 8 out of 10 times, we're going to have a complex brain situation. That means there's going to be some other co-occurring neurological condition, behavioral condition, psychiatric or genetic disorder. So it's not uncommon to have more than one thing happening. And we should be prepared for that and not immediately discount that there's no autism because the child has tuberous sclerosis, or there is no autism because they have ADHD. All right. So speaking of ADHD, 30% of the time, ADHD and autism coexist. So you've got students that are constantly seeking out novel input, what's new, what's new, what's new, but their brain is also wanting to create repetitive routine. And the last fact I want to share with you about this is almost 50% of the time, you've got students who have autism spectrum brain style differences, but they don't have intellectual deficits. So in other words, they're going to be in general education classes, they might be in gifted and talented classes, they're not going to need educational supports for academics, but they're going to have differences. So we need to pay attention to all of that. So that brings us to our visual framework and the way to really start to have a visual context. Remember I talked about how Leon, when he had the visual context with the light up toys, he could then begin to access his language. Many years ago, when I was having to sit down 2 and 3 times a day and talk with parents about their child's evaluation results, whether they had autism or not, I was finding it was tremendously not helpful to start the conversation by saying, your child met the eligibility criteria or your child has autism, because I felt like we didn't have a context to share. There wasn't really a story that we were sharing about the child. So, and it's not enough to say, I really enjoyed working with your child, he was so awesome, and he met the eligibility criteria. That doesn't do it either. I was really finding that I needed to find a way to really help the parent and myself have a context, understand what we were talking about before we called it something. And so I came up with this visual framework, and I use this every time I work with a child, which is very, very often. So, and every time I use the descriptive triangle, I actually draw this out, and I encourage you to do this too. Many of my colleagues do this as well. We don't want to hand parents a pre-printed sheet that says, here's the autism diagram, right? Why don't we want to do that? Because if we give a pre-printed sheet, then we've already told the story, right? That's no different than saying your child met the eligibility criteria. When we draw this on a piece of paper with our terrible handwriting, some of you I'm sure have wonderful handwriting, but no matter what your handwriting is like, if we draw this out step by step, we are engaging the parent in a context of describing their child. And then when we get to the conclusion of what we're going to call it, they have a context for understanding that, and they trust us, because you're going to trust someone who can actually have a conversation with you about your child. So what is the visual framework? I start out by talking about, I just draw the triangle, and I say what we're here to really understand and talk about is to answer the question, does your child show a pattern of differences in his or her development? The second thing we can ask sometimes is, does your child show a pattern of differences in his or her brain style? So this language is very important, because if we talk about differences, what happens to anxiety? It goes down, because it's like, oh, I'm curious about what those differences are, as opposed to your child showed a pattern of deficits, right? Everybody gets stressed out, right? What does this mean? What are we going to do? So we say a pattern of differences. And then we talk about, and your child showed us strengths in each area, but also some differences, right? So then you're already telling them up front, we did see a pattern of differences. We saw strengths, but we also saw differences. So that's answered that question. We know we're going to talk about differences, but we've set the visual context to talk about strengths and differences. So then I write language and communication. I said this is our first area. And I encourage you, as you're listening, you can draw this out yourself and then you can experience it. So I write language and communication on the top of the sheet. And I said, this is the first area we looked at, patterns of strengths and differences for your child, and I'll underline the word language. Almost all children have strengths in the area of language. Even a 5-year-old who's not talking yet, but when mom picks up the car keys, will go and get their shoes and go to the front door, because they know that the keys symbolize going to the park to be able to go on the swing that they like. That is showing with a visual context and an object, they're understanding communication, right? So language, or maybe they will take an object to their parent to get a need met. They might be having some emerging skills. Here, 5 years old, may have some emerging skills by saying yellow, square, circle, you know, where they're using their high-pitched, lilting conversation to visually label things, right, with a context. Those are, even though they're not strengths for the typical 5-year-old, they're strengths for this child. So you can always find some strengths in the area of language. So then you get consensus with the parent. You say, well, these are some strengths that we saw. The parent will be listening to you, and you're drawing them into a narrative that says, this is about my child. This isn't about autism. This is about my child. Yes, my child has these strengths. Then we begin to talk about differences. So then I'll say the differences come in the area of how your child uses and interprets communication, right? So then we can talk about initiating, sharing exchanges, extending, being flexible, all those things we talked about earlier. We can begin to talk about how they have it's a little bit harder work for them to be able to interpret all those things. So many times what I do with parents is, after I talk about strengths and differences in language and communication, I will ask them, does it sound like I'm describing your child? Well, what do you think they say? They say, yes, you're describing my child. This is what I experience with them. So then you have consensus and trust that you're building. So once I've said that, then I will write over here, I'll say, when your child is having to communicate, it's hard work for your child's brain. So I'll write the words hard work there. So let's listen to deconstruct that language for a minute. When I say that's hard work for your child's brain, I'm not saying it's not hard work for your child. Because if you say hard work for your child, parents internalize that something's wrong with my child. Hard work for your child's brain, even though one child said, you do realize though, even though you're talking about my brain being out here, my brain's actually in here, right? And I was like, yes, I understand that. But that language, the semantics of that are, you're talking about something in a way that is much more objective and much less about the individual, right? So yeah, it's harder work for your brain. That doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means you have to work a little harder, takes a little more energy, fatigue more quickly, and need time to regenerate to be able to handle the demands, right? So talk about hard work, I write that, and then I'll draw an arrow from hard work to communication. So you don't see the word autism on there anywhere, right? Because we're not talking about autism, we're talking about strengths and differences for that individual child. So once we get consensus on that, I move on to the second area, and I write social relationships and emotions. And I really coach people to do this in steps, right? Again, you're not laying the sheet out in front of them, you're building the story as you go. So under social relationships and emotions, I'll say this is really two areas. Let's talk first about strengths and differences in social relationships. All right, a strength for almost all children on the spectrum, and I've met many of them and spent a lot of time with them, is that they have a genuine and loving connection with all the important people in their lives. You know, they love their parents, they love their pets. They all many times have really good bonded, trusting relationships. That's not true in every single case, but 99% of the time it's true. So that is something, if it's not true, don't say it, but in most cases it's true. They've established that bond with their parents. The way they show it is different, but they have that bond and that sense of this is my place and where I feel safe. They also, oftentimes, for higher functioning students, that are in gen ed classes, most of the time they have a genuine desire for peer friendships. They want to have friends. They desperately want to have friends. But they have a gap. The difference is there's a gap between their desire for friendships and their ability to read, interpret, and use the cues. One third grader told me, he said, you might refer to me as the class jokester. And so he said, I just joke with everybody, and you want to hear a good joke? So he's doing all this stand-up comedy stuff in the classroom. But what was he missing? It was like he'd created this routine of this is who my persona is going to be in class, but where he was really struggling and getting very anxious was, it's not really working for me. People are really not enjoying it because he wasn't reading the context of when it was appropriate. So there's this gap between the genuine desire and the ability to actually do it. So social relationships, there's always areas of strength as well as some differences. So then you ask the parents, am I describing your child? What do they say? Yes, you're describing my child. So then I talk about emotions. Most children on the spectrum, almost all children, they're very good at showing you what their emotions are, right? When they're upset, when they're happy, when they're tired, all those things. Many verbal children, verbally fluid children on the spectrum can identify emotions. You know, they can say this is what it means to feel happy, sad, mad, or whatever. They can look at pictures on a standardized test and show you what does the person think or feel to a certain degree. So they understand basic emotions. The difficulties and differences for them are that they oftentimes are emotionally quite reactive and get dysregulated very quickly from their binary brain. And once they're dysregulated, they really have a hard time resetting their brains and reestablishing their thinking brain or their regulated brain. So parents will relate to that a lot. So this second area, social relationships, there's 3 areas of difference. Now we've talked about 2 of them. So hard work is already written between those 2. So then I say it's also hard work for your child's brain to engage in social relationships and manage his or her emotions, right? And be flexible in his or her thinking. And they say, yes, it's exhausting. So then we write an arrow, hard work. So this whole side of the triangle, the way the neurotypical brain, right, the bell-shaped curve of brains organizes is around social communication, emotions, relationships. Babies who are neurotypical don't have to think about it. They just automatically do it from a very young age, wired in. These 2 fundamental human interfaces are hard work for the autism brain. And parents really intuitively get that. But when they hear it from you, the evaluator, there is a gift you're giving them, which is affirmation of, yes, this is my reality, and you're describing it. Instead of saying, well, it's probably something else, right? Okay, so we still haven't said the word autism, though. All we're doing is talking about strengths and differences, hard work. Then we get to our third area, which is sensory use and interest. The criteria for autism talks about sensory use and interest as restricted interest and repetitive behaviors. It's extremely negative, and it has its place, but when we're talking to parents, when we are trying to conceptualize about individual children, instead of saying negative language like restricted interest and repetitive behaviors, nobody wants more of those, right? We want to instead talk about sensory use and interest. Why do we want to do that? Because interest and sensory use are all the things we talked about before. The form of the behavior, the function of the behavior, what routines do they create to help regulate and organize their behavior. So I talk about sensory use and interest, and I circle that. So I put a circle around sensory use and interest. In fact, we can look at the slide that shows that. Draw a circle around sensory use and interest. And the reason I do that is because that's the sensory entry point, isn't it? So really, we can talk about then strengths and differences. Strengths for children in the area of sensory use and sensory use and interest include, oftentimes they have age-appropriate interests. Many children, Leon's age, are interested in that particular video game. So it's not that he has interests that are different from his age level, right? Many young children play with Legos. So it's just the intensity and the how out of sync it is in terms of how much time it takes for him and how difficult and inflexible he is in playing or dealing with other things. Other things that really fit into this as strengths are the type of thinker the person is. So if the person is very much a three-dimensional, strategic, categorical, scientific thinker, there's all those terms that can capture how does the student or child organize and think. So we can talk about strengths. Here, the differences we're going to talk about are the inflexible thinking, right? The binary, I'm either okay or I'm not okay. And we're also going to talk about the sensitivities, which are sensitivities to noise and things like that. So that is the visual framework. Once we've said all of this, then the parents are really trusting us because we've just described their child. And we've given them a way to understand their child they really didn't have before. So if this description is the most compelling way to describe the child, then that is autism spectrum. That's what autism spectrum is. But we haven't called it that yet. We've just described the child. Now, when they take this sheet home with them, which many parents do, they take this home and it doesn't say anything about their child on there, right? It's nothing individual. This is a generic visual framework. But what they take with it is they look at it and it gives them the context to remember what you were talking about. So I had one mom who said, I still have that on my refrigerator from 2002. I said, great. I will tell you this kind of funny story. I had one mother who, I always ask them, does this describe your child? Does this describe your child? So we laid it all out and she was very, this is wonderful. Her husband was there. Yes, you've described our child. So then we get to the end, and so then I write autism spectrum on the top, right? As soon as I wrote the word autism spectrum, she starts sobbing, right? And this is typical. Parents will oftentimes have emotion, and the way to think about that is they're trusting you enough to share their emotions, so you need to be there for them. But this woman started crying and she was sobbing, and then it was pretty soon she was sobbing really hard. She just completely over the top, and the husband's like patting her on the shoulder like this, patting her, and then he's kind of like, okay, honey, let's wrap it up. We can do this at home. And she's going, no! And then he said, is it the word? Because her, her parents had been telling her it's her bad parenting. And so she had all these release of emotions, right? But she's just really wailing up a storm. I was in a room with a bunch of colleagues. They're all like, pushing the Kleenex towards me and making a beeline for the door. So we're all, so the husband said, is it the word? She said, it's the word, I can't take the word. So he reached over to the paper and he ripped off where it said autism spectrum, crumpled it up and he said, there, how's that? And she said, oh, that's okay, that's better. It was just the word. So I saw her like 3 months later and she came up to me in the school and she said, I don't know if you remember me. And I was like, real cool about it. Oh yes, I remember you. So I said, how's your son? How's everything going? And she said, great. She said, but the word doesn't bother me at all anymore. And she said, I've got that triangle on my refrigerator. We talk about autism in our house. And she said, now when I go to the store, if I see a child who I think might be on the spectrum, I go up and tell the parent about it. So I was like, maybe we should evaluate you next. Okay. So that being said, oftentimes when you're giving this diagnosis to a child, you are also talking about one of the parents or a family member because there is a genetic link for this. So when we talk about it in this respectful, narrative way, it really helps families begin to better understand what's going on in terms of why they are having hard work or struggling with communication and relationships. So the question we're asking is, how much is this pattern of strengths and differences getting in the way of the child's ability to learn, right? That's when we're looking at school eligibilities or diagnoses for therapy services. We're really looking at how much is it getting in the way of learning. So then we can look at talking about autism spectrum. Many times when I draw this diagram for parents, I don't put the word disorder on there because they know it's a disorder. It's autism spectrum. So it's the autism spectrum, differences in brain style. What I'll do is, from sensory use and interest, I will draw some arrows. and the arrow will go up to language and communication. Because we know your child is a visual contextual thinker, we know that to help support communication, we're going to need to use some visual strategies. We know because your child really needs a context to understand things that we're going to have to use some regulation tools that are visually based to help build a social narrative. One big difference socially for children on the spectrum like Leon, who can tell you everything about their preferred interests, they have not developed a social narrative. They can't tell you about themselves. They don't really know how to talk about other people. And so if we know that they like categorical visual thinking, we can begin to do things like develop a brain book for them where we begin to help them lay out, here are some facts about myself, and here are some facts about the people I play with, and how do we intersect with each other, and how do we make a visual schematic for finding a friend to play with at recess and do an activity, etc. So I draw the arrows, and then we have a line that says autism spectrum. This is the brain style. So how much is it getting in the way of the child's ability to learn from mild but significant to significant? Here the language is important as well, because instead of saying mild, we have to say mild but significant. Because if we're talking about a 4-year-old and we say they're on the mild end of the spectrum, what is the parent going to be most concerned about? Is, well, if they're only mild now, that means they're going to stop having these differences at some point. We aren't going to say they have the differences unless they really have the differences. So if they really have the differences, we want to say mild but significant. That's going to change in the way it looks over time. We do have individuals, I work with a lot of children that I've seen since they were very young, who are now going into older adolescence or young adulthood, and it truly becomes a style of thinking as opposed to something that's getting in the way of their ability to function. So it's not necessarily that it's always going to be a gap between their abilities and their goals in life, but in school, it's oftentimes it's distress the person is feeling. So then we say mild but significant to significant. The word significant is important too, because if we say severe, it's really a harsh word. Right, your child, but if we say how much is it getting in the way? Significant. It means the child requires very substantial support. Well, what would that support look like? Then we can have a conversation about that, as opposed to getting mired down in the emotions of there's something severely wrong with my child. So we want to use that language of mild but significant. And then, given all our data, the CARS 2, the rating scales, the MIGDAS 2, the ADOS, we can then put a little circle around basically where it fits. So that's the visual framework. That's what parents take with them. That's what the MIGDAS 2 is organized around, helping you identify strengths and weaknesses. So we talked for a minute about the CARS 2 standard and high functioning. I use that on almost every single evaluation. The only ones I don't use it on are verbally fluent preschoolers who are under the age of 6 because it hasn't been standardized for that. And even then, for those individuals, I'll get it out and look at the language and see how they're doing. But I really encourage you to use the CARS 2. It's the only scale, as I said, completed by you, the trained rater, and it takes all sources of information into account. The other rating scales that parents and teachers fill out, there's 2 of them that are the largest norm sample sizes, and that's the SRS-2, or the Social Responsiveness Scale, and the ASRS Autism Spectrum Rating Scales. Now, I like using, both of them have the large sample sizes, and they have preschool and school-age forms. I like using the SRS-2 for students who are in gen ed classes primarily, because it really is organized around looking at 4 aspects of communication socially. It looks at social understanding or social cognition, social awareness, social communication, and social motivation. This can be extremely helpful for planning. The other aspect of the SRS-2 that I like a lot for school-age children is it's normed according to gender. So you have female and male, and it's the only scale that does that. The ASRS is more suited in the work that I do. I go to it more and use it more for students who have more significant presentations of autism that are in more supported environments. But those 2 rating scales both are really good to use. But you have to keep in mind that because they're filled out by parents and teachers, they often yield conflicting results. So oftentimes in going out and training people in different school districts, what I find is sometimes districts will rely on parent rating scales, teacher rating scales, and observations. That's it. That's all they do. Or maybe they'll do a CARS, but they don't actually bring the child in and work with them. You really cannot get the whole picture without working with the child, because oftentimes your rating scales aren't going to line up. Then there's the ADOS, the Autism-Specific measures. The ADOS 2 modules are excellent, well used all over the world. The examiner structures the interactions and the tasks according to the levels of verbal abilities. So it is examiner driven. There's some free play in there and free time so that you get a sample of what the student does when they're by themselves. The only aspect to that, there's two aspects to that need some support. And one is that with the ADOS 2, you're only taking into account behavior that occurs during that testing session, right? So if you see the student for 45 minutes, if they could be doing all sorts of talking up a storm about their preferred topic beforehand, but if they don't do it during the administration of the test, there's no place to score that. So the scoring is relying on only that measure of behavior. The other aspect is it's not designed to have very many sensory probes. So it doesn't really probe too much for sensory behaviors. If you go beyond some physical aggression or hand and finger movements that are unusual, there aren't a lot of sensory probes there. So the score is derived from the key items, and only the behavior that's observed is in the algorithm. So it can be very helpful to use. Many people use the ADOS 2 and use the sensory-based MIGDAS approach. So the MIGDAS 2 interviews, I would recommend if you're using the ADOS, before you start your ADOS administration, do the sensory-based interview for 30 minutes or so. When you do that, you get this amplification of all the sensory entry point behaviors, and so then you've answered that question, and then you can see how the student responds in prompts. You can also find, if they find something that they really like let's say they really enjoy putting together the magnet pieces. With students, they oftentimes, if they're putting this together and you put this together, and you put that in there, what happens? Then they're going to say, you're messing with my stuff, I don't want to do that. So, but when they're finding something that they really like to do, then what you can do is, when they're doing the ADOS, you could do a work break scenario where they do something that regulates them, and then they go back and really put some effort into the ADOS task, as opposed to having low effort the whole time. So the MIGDAS 2, you can use that by itself or with the ADOS. So the MIGDAS 2 interviews, I've talked to you about the system of the parent and teacher interviews already to get those narrative perspectives from the sources. And then we're also going to look at what else you get for it. So the protocols that you're going to use when you're actually working with students are one of three protocols. The first one is for students with limited to no verbal fluency, and that's for individuals. So you can use that all the way up through adulthood. But in my practice and all of my experience, adults who have insignificant presentation of autism are most of the time diagnosed well before adulthood. So it's really for children and adolescents with individuals with limited to no verbal fluency. It can be used as young as toddlers, so you can use it from a very young age. The second protocol is for verbally fluent children and adolescents, and the third protocol is for verbally fluent adults. So there are three protocols that you can use. So if you're testing a student and then you want to go home and test one of your family members, just use the verbally fluent adult one. That's a little joke. Don't do that. Evaluate your family members without their permission. Okay. So you've got that descriptive language, right, and everything that we talked about before, and it's organized into the three main categories, not surprisingly, of sensory use and interest, language and communication, and social relationships and emotions. So each section highlights specific features that are designed to help you elicit that individualized sample. So, for example, one of the categories is intonation and inflection under language and communication. So instead of saying they have an odd intonation or inflection or an unusual way of speaking, you're given the language to really identify what it looks like. For example, many children who have the autism spectrum brain style, when they're using their language, they use it for labeling, and they have a distinctive way of speaking. It can be either a very stilted or formal way, like our friend who said, you could say that I have some technical difficulties. That's kind of a formal way of speaking. Or you have children who have more of a high-pitched lilting and nasal intonation. Like, for instance, they might be looking at this, which is visual. It's a wand that has some little glitter things in it. They might be saying, it's a star, it's a moon, it's a red one, right? So that's what we would call more scripted language, but really what it is it's high-pitched intonation and inflection, it's lilting, and it's exclamatory. You can almost hear the exclamation point. It's a red one, right? You can hear that at the end of the sentence. Or I've got one guy, this is a little pop-up Bob I use sometimes, and so I had one student come in and he said, I hear you, I see you, I smell you. And then every time I'd ask him a question, he'd say, I hear you, I see you, I smell you. So what did he do with this? He created his routine, which was, I have no idea how to answer your question, but I can do this, right? So you'll see, but his way of talking was nasal and unusual. So the MIGDAS 2 protocol guides you to be able to recognize, do these descriptions that are consistent with ASD describe my experience, or do these? There's also a place on each page of the protocol for the 3 areas that we're looking at for you to take notes. So you can transcribe your notes, because it's not designed for you to to be interacting with the child and say, hold on a minute, I've got to write down everything you did, right? I've gotten really good at writing while I'm watching, right? Which most evaluators get good at that. And then I transfer it over to the form. Then when you're ready to write your report, you open up the parent interview MIGDAS protocol and type out what the parent says. You open the teacher one and type out, and then you've got your MIGDAS 2 verbally fluent or limited to no verbal fluency protocol, and you open that up and you type those answers. So you basically have your report is designed to help you write your report as well. Okay, so under the section of sensory use and interest, one of the features is responds to materials containing visual and movement properties. Because what you're going to need to do the MIGDAS 2, and you can find examples of this on the WPS website, you're going to need categories of sensory materials because they don't come with the manual or kit. And the reason is because it's not a standardization of how you do it. I coach teams all the time of school psychologists and speech therapists in schools when they have difficult cases, and they will have different materials than I have, but the end result is the same. So you need materials that have visual properties, that have movement properties, that have tactile properties and auditory properties. So, but under sensory use and interest, one of the category of items is how did the individual respond to materials that had visual and movement properties. So of course, light up things like this have visual and movement properties. The things like this wand, that is, or anything that has visual movement, doing things where you are able to see and move at the same time. We're going to see some examples of that in a minute. Then there are prompts that are provided for you in the MIGDAS 2 protocols to really help you know what you're looking for and how to set that up. For example, you'll be prompted with the sensory materials to not talk a lot and not use social talking, because you just need to be reminded of that so that you're exploring the materials. Oftentimes, when you're exploring materials with a student, if you have more than one, you can do the same thing the child is doing or mirror their behavior. And this also helps you take the perspective of the child and see what your experience is like. So you have your observations that are listed, and you also have that descriptive language that allows you, if you are doing your evaluation with more than one person in the room, more than one evaluator, you have not just the language you've learned as a school psychologist, the language the speech therapist has learned as a speech pathologist, which don't really correspond with each other. You have a common descriptive language to use. All right, so the 2 side-by-side columns are for each item that you're looking at are behavior responses that are consistent with autism spectrum differences, not consistent with autism spectrum differences. So you can really all the time be measuring and weighing out neuroatypical responses to neurotypical responses. And unless you have a pattern of neuroatypical responses across all three areas, then you probably don't have autism, because autism is a complex brain style difference that says you have three. So you also have a place to record your information. But at the end of the protocols, there is a page called the pattern of observations. So instead of getting a score at the end, what you're going to do is look at, for each of the items, did you have more things on the side that was consistent with ASD, more things that were consistent with not ASD, or was it unclear? You had a little bit of both. What you'll see is a scatter plot at the end that will show you that you've either got the triangle of differences or you don't. I just worked on a case not too long ago with a team where they had gone in and done the ADOS, and the child had not qualified as being on the autism spectrum. In other words, the score was not significant. So they wanted to come back and do the MIGDAS 2 as well, because the school was saying, "Are you sure? We think you missed it," or something like that. So there was some questioning. So the team went in and they did the MIGDAS protocol. So what they did was do sensory-based play. When we went through all the pattern of observations and we came to the summary sheet, this child's profile did not fit the autism profile. In other words, most of the things the child was doing, even though it was, as I said, 83% of the time, this child had other things going on in terms of differences in development, but they didn't have that pattern at all of that. So we had two measures, one standardized, one that was qualitative, that both showed the lack of the, but what the MIGDAS gave us was not only that it's confirmation that it was ruled out, what else did it give us? It gave us the language to be able to have a conversation with the school that was resisting this outcome, to be able to say, these are the things the child is doing that we're really happy to see, because we wouldn't see this if they had the autism brain style. So we gave us the language to support our ruling it out rather than just a score. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the 10 tips. This is our last part. We're going to talk about 10 tips for evaluators who are using the MIGDAS 2 sensory-based interview approach. Okay, so the first thing you need to remember is that you're following a 3-step process. The first step, as you're sure to remember, is you use sensory materials and topics. That's the first step. The second step is you are going to then introduce social relationships and emotions. For nonverbal children, the way you introduce social relationships and emotions is you start to intrude on their play a little bit. Like, for instance, a student at the beginning, they might be doing theirs, you might be doing yours. But then the social part of it is to say, what happens if I mess around with your stuff, right? Do you play with me or not, right? So we want to see then adding those social and emotional components. So that's the second, and then the third one is we want some sort of measure of physical movement. Oftentimes with the autism brain, one of the sensory differences is general motor clumsiness, not all the time, but much of the time. And there's also a lot of difficulty with being able to do motor planning and being able to finish a task. For instance, at the end of the assessment, I oftentimes will engage a child in a game of catch, right? And you're prompted to do this with either a Velcro ball or mitt, or this is called a switch pitch. So Fred, why don't you come up here and we'll do this. So you're going to be the psychologist, and I'm going to be the student with autism. And I'm going to show you 2 common responses, because playing a game of catch, you've invited me to play with you. This is a social game, right? Sure. So you're going to ask me if I'm ready.
Are you ready?
I'm ready. Oh, how does that work? Oh, that's amazing. Look at that. Yeah. Oh, I see how it works. Yeah. Oh, that is really cool. Oh my God. So what am I doing? Socially, I'm completely writing him off, right? It's like, so it's Fred's not in the equation. He can be standing there with his hands out, right? He can be saying, hey, it's great to play catch with you. And I'm not cueing into that, because what am I? Object focused, right? Here's another response that I might have. Okay, so ask me if I'm ready.
Are you ready?
I'm ready. I'm going to have a startle response, which means it's hard plastic, it's incoming, unpredictable, and even if I'm super smart in the gifted and talented class, I'm still not going to catch that thing, right? Okay, and so here's another one. Let's do a third one.
Are you ready?
Yes. Well, you know, we were talking about Super Mario. Well, one time when Cappy was doing this, it was really amazing and really, you should have been playing that game. And you know, the Majora's Mask was really good. Have you ever had the bunny hood of that mask? It's really fantastic. And so what happened to our game? It stopped, right? Okay, so now you put your hands out to show me. Okay, so then I'm talking with you and then I'm gonna go, okay, so yes, the Ocarina of Time was a really good game. It came out in 1992, I think. I'm pretty sure. I'm not exactly positive, but oh, right. So you see how there's just not that fluid ability to play a game. Thank you, Fred. So this is why you want to have them play a game with you, because they're not able to really do it very well. All right, so then let's talk about the types of sensory materials. We just looked at, we want things that are interesting. Like this switch pitch is interesting for many people. It's actually designed by a guy named Hoberman. He designs many toys, and he also is an architect. He designs buildings, so he's a designer, and they're very interesting for all people, but they're essential then that they're not just things that, this actually does something. It shows you how physical properties work. So we want to create and collect things that are visual cause-effect objects that are of interest. We also want to use noisemakers because we do want to see what happens when unexpected sounds happen, and we also want to see what happens when they're in control of making the sound. For example, here is something that I use oftentimes as a noisemaker. This is a percussion instrument called a thunder tube. It has a drum skim on the end and it has a metal coil. So when you shake it, it makes an awesome sound, right? So I had one student that when I shook it like this, he went like this and he said, "Sorry, I have a minor flinch problem." Got really freaked out about it. But oftentimes students will begin to flinch and put their hands up to their ears because what is it? It's incoming stress, unpredictable, right? Because they're not in control of it. Sometimes if a student gets really frightened by it, right, and says, "It's too loud," right, or something like that, then you can say, "Do you want me to put it away or leave it on the table?" So then they can, if they say put it away, then you put it in a container. But oftentimes they will not be that upset by it. But once they have done it, then you give it to them. And if they grasp it, which means they're interested in it, then now you're in control of it. Now what are you going to do? Oh, you're going to enjoy it. And oftentimes what happens when you're in control of it, then the autism brain sensory response or reflex to pleasurable input begins to happen. You'll see hands splaying out behind them, you'll see facial grimacing, you'll see body tensing, hand flapping, all of those repetitive behaviors that don't come out in a more formal assessment like the ADOS because you're not using the stimulus materials to create those. But if the child doesn't have autism, like if you just have ADHD, then man, that thing is flying all over the place and you're making noises with it, but you're also socially engaging with me about it, right? I like to always have more than one of these objects. So let's say you're shaking yours, I want to have one that I'm shaking as well. So there's several autism responses. One is to hijack the whole thing, grab mine and go off to the other side of the room. Many students do that. But what might happen is when you do it, I do what you're doing. I did this with an 11-year-old girl a couple weeks ago, and we did this for what seemed like a really long time, right? Because that thing's pretty loud. So she was just really loving it. So we're asking the question with the MIGDAS 2 process, how much and how long? We're not asking, oh, she did it, let's put it away and get another item out. We really want to see, if this girl can shake this all day, is she going to shake it all day? Well, she almost did. She shook it for a long period of time. We did it so long together that I thought maybe I'm extending this. So I very carefully, I put mine, I picked it up and put it on the table very quietly. It didn't make any bit of difference. She just kept going. And then finally when she was done, she gave this nice sigh and she put it gently on the table. 20 minutes later, she went back to it. So what we're seeing is, if this is an amplification of the autism brain, right? If we see this amplification, then what we see is, oh, she did that for 30 minutes. When she's in a classroom, she's having to, she isn't able to do any of that kind of stuff. So by the time she gets home, no wonder her mom's saying she's pacing the room and, rocking back and forth and is getting really upset if she has to do homework, right? So that is an example of using a noisemaker. Then we're going to want science materials, tactile objects, and if the child draws, have some of their artwork, because oftentimes what happens with the artwork is it's the same thing over and over and over again, right? Many times I've seen many students who are into anime and manga, and they draw the same anime characters over and over and over again. So if they have art books that they draw in, have them bring them in. Two things happen. One is you see the repetitive nature and how much they have to do the same thing to stay organized. The second thing that you have is you have an opportunity with a visual context to start a more in-depth conversation for students who need the visual to really talk with you about their things. Because many times students will be really, really into what they love, but they don't have the verbal fluency to really tell you about it. If they have the visuals, you'll see the differences. And then, of course, I talked about playing catch already. All right, here's an example of ways that the light-up toys can be used. Many times students will line them up, they'll place them in categories, they'll look at them and explore them from different visual angles. So you'll see all of the things they do with the visual materials. An interesting fact is, I'm always running out of, like they always do what this thing is doing today, which is they just aren't as, I don't feel the love with this one today. So when they start to sort of give out, I'll go and buy more, right? Because they're not that expensive. So I typed in one day on a search engine, spinning light-up toys, and it took me to 7 rave sites. No. So apparently these are very popular at rave parties. It cracked me up. I was like, oh, a whole other population. There might be some crossover here. Yeah, sure. Okay, so if you need to go to a rave, or if you do go to raves, you've probably already got a collection. All right, so these are examples of other visual movement things. This is a water toy that you push a button and then the rings can go on the game is to get all the rings on. And so you can find out with students with this one. Recently a student sat there and he sustained his attention to that until he got every single ring on. And sometimes, because it's just a little water toy, you'll get almost all the rings on and then some of them will start to come off, right? He was completely focused. So what did that tell us? He has a brain that's very goal-directed, right? He really wants to finish stuff. We didn't talk the whole time he was doing it because he doesn't talk when he's doing it. So the other thing we learned is when he's object-focused on a task, the language part of his brain doesn't engage. So this tells us, well, we don't want to be blah, blah, blahing to him when he is trying to finish a task or he's going to explode. That's a visual timer too. So there's common objects. These are wind-up toys that have visual movement sound properties to them. So when you wind them up, they move across the table, so they make a lot of noise, but they also are unpredictable, right? So with the child who has ADHD without autism, they love this because then they want them all wound up at the same time because it's big input, but they also do what? They have a social element of, let's have a race, and I'll win every single time, because if I'm not winning, I'll throw yours off the table. So, they'll do a social game with it. Children with autism spectrum, when these things are coming to them, just like when Fred was throwing the ball to me and I didn't catch it, they have an instinctive startle response and reflex, and they'll back away with a frightened look on their face and won't touch it. So you'll see some really distinctive, unusual things. You'll also see when you wind all these up and they're moving all over the table, many times children will just do what I call a little visual drive-by. All of a sudden they'll duck down and they'll just do a quick peripheral eye gaze on the side of the table. So you'll see all the autism sensory behaviors come out when you have sensory materials. This is what one child did with all the materials. Okay, so remember we talked about systematic categorical thinkers. What did she do? She organized them all into categories. And then she would play with them for a while, and then she'd organize them back again. So this is what we mean when we say visual organization, systematic learner. So in the classroom, what needs to happen for her is she needs to have a visual, organized, systematic system. These are the ball of wax that I've shown you in the front of the thing. I love these because it's a Stanford trained physicist who's come up with these. These are actual magnets, and they come in different ball configurations. Each one comes with a 96-page instruction manual, which is really awesome. Okay, so I totally hope I get to meet him someday. But so these are samples of what they look like, the different ones. What you'll see with children who are on the spectrum is if you start the conversation with a middle school or a high school student by having these on the table, and the only thing that's on the table are these, and they're sort of half put together. I actually do this from anywhere from 3-year-olds all the way up through adults. I'll just have several of these half constructed on the table. What the individual will do is they will engage with the object and they'll finish this, right? So once they finish it and they have that nice satisfying experience, then what they'll do is oftentimes take it apart and very systematically line everything up or organize it or categorize it, right? If you put these two close together, they do that, right? So instead of having them be close together, the person lines them up and is very systematic and methodical in the way they do it. Then they'll put it together, and guess what happens after that? They take it apart again. So what you'll see is this way of organizing and regulating. So instead of having to ask someone that knows the student, does the student do this? You actually see it unfold in front of you, and then you're more likely to endorse that, yes, this is autism if you see it. Because the neurotypical brain may do it once or twice, but they're not going to do it over and over again, right? So they'll find one or two things that they like and they'll repeatedly work with them. I have one young man that I'm working with who's a 13-year-old. Every time he comes into my office, I have some puzzles that are really hard. It's a Rubik's ball where you have to have gears that shift and then they make different colors. I don't know how he does it, but he comes in and he's got like a big mop of orange hair and he's into robotics and he just looks like a mad scientist. He's just a super smart kid. So he comes in and he goes, someone's disorganized your ball again. He organizes it. Then before he leaves, he goes over and organizes all the other ones. So this is a student who took the magnet balls and his passionate area of interest is Pokemon. So what did he do? He said, I love your Pokemon toys. Well, what did he do? He created a water and a fire Pokemon. All right, so this is something too that's kind of, we want things that have interesting tactile and movement sensory properties. So this is, come on up here again and we'll do this with you. Fred, this is it's in a bag. The autism brain loves containers. So the more things that you can have that are in containers that they can open and take apart, really good. I oftentimes use a compact mirror for younger children to do facial recognition and feelings. And the compact mirror is so much more effective than just giving them a mirror because there's that process of opening the container. Opening things is an organizing behavior for the autism brain. So I would say to you, oh Fred, look what's in my purple bag. Okay, so put your arm out, Fred. You ready?
I'm ready.
And so you like the feel of that. And it goes up and down, right?
Yeah.
You might even take your shoes off and make it go from one leg to the other. Right, but let's say you didn't like the feel of that. What are you going to do if that startled you and you didn't like it? Right, and then you're going to rub it off your arm. You take it off your arm as fast as possible, right? Yeah, exactly. So you're going to have, so then you either have a sensitivity response or you have an engagement response, right? So now once you, thank you, Fred, as soon as you, now when you're playing with it, you can sit back down again. See if you can make it go flat again. Because that's part of the challenge as well, is to figure out how to do it. So these things all have interesting properties, right? They are movement, they're unpredictable, they're unexpected, but they're objects as opposed to social people. So what we find out is once it's established, and he's done it one time, you did great with that, Fred.
Thank you.
Okay, can I show you how to do it? You just push on the top like that. So it goes like that. Okay, you do it. There you go. Fantastic. You put it back in the bag. So things like this are also part of that. This is a Rubik's snake, right? So it can be, you can actually make this into a sphere. See if you can make that into a sphere. It's like, oh, right. So here's one that is an origami world map. So you can put the black pieces, the magnet pieces inside, and you can turn it into an actual sphere. So these are all things that have tactile, movement, interesting properties. You did great. Fantastic. I love what you made out of that. That is great. I had one girl come in one day, and she did something similar to this, and she said, it's my metal detector. I was like, great. You just never stop being entertained. It's so interesting when people work with things. You can have other tactile things like this. These are called monkey noodles. And so you can do things like this with them. Make a really cool sound, right? You can also, I don't know if I can do it correctly, but you can also throw it at somebody, right? Getting a little too ADHD in here now. You can tie them together, you can braid them, you can smell them, you can push them up against your cheek. There are all sorts of different sensory responses. Go ahead, give it a good twirl. Yeah, it's satisfying, isn't it? Yeah. And a bit alarming. Yes, satisfying and a bit alarming. So we want to have things that have these interesting properties. So what the child associates you with, or the adolescent, is this is an environment where it's not going to stress me out. And I'm going to be able to take the things I like and ignore the things I'm not. I did talk to you about starting out with 1 or 2 things on the table. What I encourage people to do is you start out with 1 or 2 things, then you keep adding things. So that the table has a lot of stuff on it. So some people don't like that, right? And some examiners say, oh, that's too messy, we need to clean up. Well, you have to bypass, override your own conditioning. And what you're going to want to do is then, once a critical mass of things are on the table, you can ask the student, do you want to keep it on the table or put it away? And then you have an absolutely lovely display of what are the properties of the things they want on the table. So you can see the form and the function. So the geoflux, that's a good one. Here are some balls. We saw the switch pitch. There's the Hoberman. Both of these are by Hoberman, the one that is the geosphere. This one is a ball that has a suction cup in the middle. So if you push on the orange top, the suction cup turns into a frisbee, and then eventually the suction at an unpredictable rate comes off and it pops back up and makes a loud sound. So I was with a 4-year-old not too long ago, and this is an example of creating and maintaining a routine. So I pushed the ball down to show how to do it, and then I said, wait for it, so he wouldn't touch it, right? So he got that. So then we waited for it, and then pop, it went pop, and he said, oh! And I said, oh! So then the next time I push it down, I said, wait for it, pop, oh, oh! So that was our routine, right? So then the third time I push it down, and I don't say wait for it. So what does he do? He goes, in other words, come on, lady, you got to do your part, right? So you get this qualitative sense that you are an extension of the object-focused routine, right? So you can probably guess that his tolerance for that was a little higher than the average bear. So we did that over 75 times. So when I got in my car to leave that school, I'm driving my car away and I'm going, wait for it, oh, oh. It took me probably 2 hours to regulate after that, because it was really something. But what did it tell us is that he really needs that. And it also told us that at 4, he's doing really what more 18-month-olds do, right? Because 18-month-olds, they want you to do peekaboo 5,000 times. They want to chase you around the house 100 times. So that repetition was out of sync with his age level, because it was like a younger child. But it was also his social currency, right? This was his way. He was genuinely enjoying having me be an extension of his play. So we want to look for those, how much and how long with some of these objects. Here's an example of how you can show if you put an object on top of it. Guess what happens to Pop-Up Bob? He gets popped over. You can use also, I like having tactile things like, in addition to the monkey noodles, is to have sensory stress balls of different textures, because you can see, do they want deep pressure? Do they like the light touch? What is it that is their sensory organizing preference? And then these are the thunder tubes. As I said, I have several of those. And then the balls for catch. When you're doing the social probes, it's oftentimes helpful if you have something physical. So when you're asking, in the MIGDAS 2 for the verbally fluent, you're asking children to make 3 wishes, to tell you 3 facts about themselves, and also to tell you 3 things they would change to make school a better place for them. So if we just ask those questions and they're engaged in their routine play where they're just putting the magnet ball together yet another time, they're less likely to flexibly shift from this to being responsive and answering my question. So we want to set up a work break routine, and this is how we do it. The way that the work is signaled is you're playing and I give this to you. So this is a transition object. I've given you something, you're holding it, and I've broken your routine because it's a transition object. Now you're ready to hear me. So I'll say, okay, so I want you to make 3 wishes while you have the wand. Wish number 1, I wish.
Am I wishing?
Yes, you are.
I don't know.
Oh, I don't know. It's too embarrassing. I don't want to make a wish. Okay, so she makes a wish, or she does what the autism person does. You'll be a perfect autism person here because you got the startle response look, and you went blank, and you were like, "Am I supposed to make a wish?" This is what happens oftentimes with the kids because she might have been telling me volumes about My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic, Hasbro's 1992, blah blah blah. She can tell me all about that, but when I say make 3 wishes, it's like, what? So this is a typical autism response, right? Is to not talk, right? So, see me after this. So that's a typical response. Another typical response is to say if Hasbro My Little Pony is to have all the My Little Ponies in the world. And one girl told me, she said, if the My Little Pony universe was real and I could live in it, right? So it'll just be more about their topic. So then once you've told me something about My Little Pony.
Sure.
And then, okay, yeah, sure. And then when I reach out and take it from you and back off, what am I signaling? We're done. So then I've established a routine that I'm going to put a demand on you, and then the demand's going to go away, right? So this is having transition objects can be very helpful when you're doing the social probes because oftentimes they just shut down and don't want to tell you anything. So I use the compact mirror for younger children and feelings cards for when I'm asking them to tell me facts about the social narrative about friends and family and feelings. Then with drawing, this is an example of a student that he really liked drawing these Cartoon Network characters. So when he came in, he had his verbal IQ was measured in the low 60s, almost in the 50s. So he didn't have verbal fluency, but his nonverbal IQ was tested in the average range, 92 to 98, something like that, just under 100. So he draws all the time, right? So when I started the interview with him, I knew he liked Yoshi, and that's Mario. So Yoshi has these little eggs that comes with him, right? So I drew the eggs, and then I put the pencil down for a little drawing throwdown. So I just put the pencil down. We didn't talk at all. So a couple minutes went by. He picks up the pencil. He draws Yoshi. I said Yoshi goes with. He drew Mario, and then he drew the rest of them. It took him maybe less than 2 minutes to make those drawings because he does these drawings over and over and over again, right? So does he have really good visual memory, and does he have good ability to take that visual memory and put it into a representational form? Fantastic. So artwork is something you can use with the students as well. All right, so what are the goals of the interview? The reason you're doing all this with the student is so that you can share an experience with them. And when you're sharing that experience with them, you're also learning how to take their perspective. Instead of, oftentimes people say about autism, oh, the person with autism cannot take the perspective of other, or they have trouble with perspective taking. Well, what they never experience is someone getting and taking their perspective. So when you take the perspective of the student and follow their lead, you really get rich data and information about how they think. And then, of course, you're going to limit your talking at the start of the session. The third thing is, of course, familiarize yourself with the child's area of interest. There are plenty of times when I have gone into an interview with a child and we don't have necessarily the most updated area of interest. Maybe they've been into dinosaurs for 3 years, but today they switched over to something else and mom didn't tell us about it. So what we do with that is just ask them, when you're at home, when you go home today, what are you going to want to do? And so if they say, one girl said, strawberry shortcake, and I was like, what is that? So we finally figured out she was saying strawberry shortcake. So we just got out and Googled images for strawberry shortcake. Then we had the visual context, and she started telling us more than we wanted to know about that. Okay, decide what sensory materials are appropriate to use. So some of these things are, I use for younger children. I use more inset puzzles and things that are more for cause-effect type of younger child toys. But many of the things I brought today to show you are things that you can use with all age levels. Probe for the sensory entry point to establish the shared conversation. Some students are very visual, but some students are very tactile. So if the visual entry point doesn't really get them, then have something tactile and move on until you probe for the entry point to establish that shared conversation. If you're conducting your interview as a multidisciplinary team, make sure you have one person be the lead, because otherwise you have people jumping in all the time and the child, you don't get that nice quality of, this is what happens with the autism brain. When I'm in a room with a child and maybe 4 or 5 other examiners, because that oftentimes there's a big group sometimes when I'm evaluating. So the child will be there and we'll be here with our materials, right? We'll be doing our stuff back and forth. And then there's a whole group of people here. Someone, like let's say Fred is on my team, and so I'm talking with you and you're telling me all about Star Trek, and then there was an episode where there was a space dog, and so then Fred says, I have a dog at home. So then you might say, and then you might ask Fred a question, but you don't flexibly look at him, you just ask me. So if you have a group and one person is the lead, you have that laser beam of the child only interacts with you and can't flexibly shift to the other person. Understand that the interview begins as soon as you interface with the child. So just jump right into asking them questions about what they're interested in, or say, hey, I'm stuck on this level, can you help me? Ask comparison questions and make factual comments. So saying things like, instead of what do you like, you can say, tell me about, show me, use more of those declarative things as opposed to what and how questions, and then make factual statements. So if you say something, if you have your fact about, there was one video game I'd never heard of before, and I went online and learned a little bit about it and had some facts about, it was good to be a gnome, I think, and you got gold coins at some level. So I said that, so when you're a gnome and you get your gold coins, and then the student just he was about 12, he went, you could see him computing, it's like, well, she knows nothing. It was like so wonderful, he was so dismissive with his face. And then he went well, but he really wanted to talk about it, so because he had autism. So he corrected me in great detail about that. But the factual statement was my opening salvo to say, let's have a conversation about this. Mirror the child's manner of speaking, meaning that you're not mimicking or talking just like they are, but we want to pace to the child. So oftentimes children on the spectrum, when they are responding to questions, they need a long processing time. In other words, they need time to flexibly shift from what they're focused on to take in the information, organize and retrieve, and give the response, right? So that takes time. So when we are being helpful as adults, verbally fluent adults, we oftentimes fill the space with asking more questions or making more comments. So mirroring means pacing yourself to however slow the student is speaking. And then I will change the student's narrative even during the evaluation and say things like, I really admire that you're such a careful thinker. Before you answer my question, you really think about it, and you don't say anything until you're sure of what you want to say, right? So then they say, when I'm with a child and their parents, I'll say, I've noticed that, John really enjoys being able to figure out how to solve these puzzles without people talking. Okay, so this is what John, 100 times over, the children do. They go like this. In other words, you're correct. So you can give words to describing what their brains are doing during the evaluation, and that's part of the power of changing the narrative during the evaluation. All right, let things go in an unexpected direction with the child as your guide. That's what I'm talking about with letting the thunder tube go on and on. Or the question was, when you're playing Ocarina of Time, has this ever happened, right? So instead, I've said, ask me a question, any question. So you have anywhere from the children who've been in speech therapy a lot who say, what is your favorite color? What is your favorite number, right? Things like that, versus students who, high school students who might look at your badge, if you have a badge in the school, and they'll say, how often do you come to my school? Or my favorite question, which is, when are you coming back? Because they have such a good time, they want you to come back. All right, so that basically is what you're doing. When you introduce the social and emotional topics, we do want those visual prompts that I talked about as conversation starters and some cards and things like that. Let's talk about the things when we talk about 3 words to describe yourself. I'm going to give you an example from a girl. This is what she used to describe herself when I gave her her wand. And then 3 wishes. The 3 words to describe yourself. I'm video game-ish. I'm cartoonish. And she said, I'm not much of a girly girl. So I said, what do you mean that you're not much of a girly girl? And she said, I was interested, like what level are we talking about? Not much of a girly girl. And she said, I do not like the way I feel when I see the color pink. Okay, that wasn't what I was expecting, but that's why I asked, right? So we all look around the room, everybody's wearing black and dark colors, right? So there's a coyote mascot for the building sitting by the window, and it's got an old scraggly red kerchief around its neck that's been faded by being in the window. So I said, you mean like the color of that kerchief that's on that dog over there? So she cuts her eyes over to look at it briefly, and she says, well, first of all, that's a coyote and not a dog. And she said, and second of all, no, I don't like the way I feel when I look at that. So I was like, okay, well, enough of that. But embedded in that is what? These are brief responses. There's no extension or elaboration. It's just a response to the task. But it also is a signifier, right? This is very much telling you some descriptive detail about the student. All right, see if you can guess what this guy's passionate area of interest is. 3 wishes. Hermes winged sandals. And that's not Hermes from Beverly Hills. That's Hermes, his actual winged sandals. His invisible helmet. And to have the bows and arrows of Apollo. Aren't those wonderful wishes? It's like, wouldn't it be great if the world was all about Greek mythology? Right. All right, so then end with your physical activity with a switch pitch or a Velcro ball and mitts, or if they're older, just walk together. Because what happens oftentimes for high school students, when you're in those big, giant, cavernous high schools, right, they'll you're going to a room, and they will walk ahead of you, oftentimes with their torso out and walking on the balls of their feet, and they're not referencing you, and they don't even know where they're going, but they're ahead of you, right? So walking together can give you a lot of good information as well. All right, so make sure that in conclusion, really I want to make sure that as you're doing these evaluations, I hope that this, in our time together, you've gotten a feel for or an understanding of how you can enhance your autism evaluations by having a context and by really individualizing the way that you do the sensory entry point. So make sure that your evaluations are focused on obtaining that behavioral profile for the individual student, right? Strengths and differences. And ask yourself, are you routinely doing the following things? Are you completing a detailed parent interview prior to working with the student? And are you carefully considering parent report? One thing that is oftentimes challenging in schools that I see a lot is parents will talk about their child and want to give information, and sometimes the school is reluctant to really trust what they're saying. And parents are telling you what they're living. They're not making it up. So we need to really carefully consider parent report instead of discounting it. And then we also need to make sure that we're using a range of behavior rating scales, including the CARS 2, the SRS, and so on. We want to make sure that you're routinely including your sensory-based behavior sample, where the student is encouraged to follow his or her preferred areas of interest. We want to make sure that we're routinely using descriptive language to create that individualized behavioral profile of strengths and differences. So we want to talk about the brain style in positive, empowering terms. And routinely, we want to hold off on our diagnostic determinations until the very end, right? So don't call it anything until you've described, and you're taking all sources of information into account. And remember, if it happens in one setting, autism doesn't just sort of happen sometimes. So if it's happening in one setting, that's autism. If it's not happening in another setting, then we have to really begin to understand that the demands of different environments may or may not exceed the child's capabilities, as opposed to it can't be autism because it doesn't happen everywhere.